It started with stomach cramps, then vomiting, then seizures. By sunrise, dozens were in the hospital, and no one knew why. An entire Soviet town, suddenly and inexplicably poisoned. No warnings, no explanations, just silence. But this wasn't an accident. It was a test. And the people living there, they were never meant to survive it. During the Cold War, both the West and the Soviets raced to build weapons that could level cities, but behind closed doors, a quieter kind of warfare was unfolding, one that didn't leave bomb craters or firestorms. Instead, it flowed silently through faucets and pipes. Soviet agents didn't just spy on foreign soil, they sometimes turned their own citizens into experiments. This is the story of a town targeted not by enemies, but by the very country sworn to protect it. The town was called Severozorsk, but it might as well have been nameless. Tucked into the frostbitten lowlands of central Russia, far from any strategic rail junction or political hub, Severozorsk had been built in the 1950s as a model workers' settlement, only to be forgotten by the very state that had erected it. It wasn't on tourist maps. It didn't produce luxury goods or breakthrough science. Its only export was processed sodium borate, mined from a nearby deposit and refined in a humming gray plant that coughed steam into the sky. The residents, just over 9,000 in number, were factory laborers, teachers, pensioners, and state clerks, none of whom held any position of consequence outside the town's limits. People here were born, worked, married, drank, and died in a predictable loop. They watched the world on black and white televisions, spoke in whispers about Moscow politics, and never expected to matter to anyone beyond their district office. That was exactly what made Severozorsk ideal. In Cold War strategy, invisibility was a resource, and this town had it in abundance. The municipal infrastructure was outdated, functional, and barely maintained. A single water plant served the entire region, pulling groundwater into vast iron tanks before piping it untreated into homes, schools, and the factory itself. No one asked where it came from, and no one cared how it tasted, so long as it kept the boilers running and the bathtubs filled. There were no redundant systems, no safety protocols, no independent inspectors, just a foreman named Yuri with a clipboard and a chain-smoking assistant who rarely left the control room. The water flowed unmonitored through rusting pipes beneath cracked pavement and poured from taps into chipped enamel basins. Most of the buildings were relics of Khrushchev's era, square concrete blocks with mold-blackened corners and stairwells that echoed with the sounds of children and stray cats. The schoolhouse had 15 classrooms and one working telephone. The clinic had 3 doctors, 1 ambulance, and a pharmacy that ran out of penicillin every February. But despite all this, or perhaps because of it, Severozorsk functioned like a closed loop, self-sufficient, self-contained, and entirely unimportant to the outside world. That's why the agents chose it. In secret rooms hundreds of kilometers away, someone had marked it on a map not with a red star, but with a question. What happens when you treat a town like a lab rat? The logic was brutal and precise. If something went wrong, it could be blamed on the weather, the pipes, or the people's own negligence. If it went right, it could be replicated elsewhere, maybe in a NATO-controlled region, maybe in a future war. No journalists would arrive, no foreign intelligence agency would notice. The town didn't matter, and so, in the winter of 1972, someone in a gray suit signed an order to make Severozorsk sick on purpose, to weaponize its obscurity. The people here would keep drinking. They would never know what was already flowing into their lives. At first, it was just a few sick days. Children kept home from school with what teachers called a stomach bug, elderly pensioners missing their morning chess games on the benches outside the town square. But by the end of the second week, the pattern was too strange to ignore. The local clinic, a squat 2-story building with flaking green paint and an always damp waiting room, began filling at odd hours with cases that seemed unrelated on paper, but unnervingly identical in symptoms. It wasn't just nausea and fatigue. These were sudden collapses, violent vomiting episodes, and hallucinations described by patients with wide, glassy eyes. Entire families fell ill within 24 hours of each other, yet no shared meal or spoiled market item could be traced. Factory workers at Plant 4, assigned to entirely different chemical lines, began fainting mid-shift, hands trembling uncontrollably before losing consciousness. A school teacher, a 7-year-old, and a 68-year-old war veteran were all admitted on the same morning, none of them having had any physical contact or even overlapping routines. The town's chief physician, Dr. Mikhail Ilyin, a cautious man trained during the height of Stalin-era obedience, began keeping a private log of cases, noting in shorthand the accelerated clustering and how the onset of symptoms appeared to follow no seasonal flu cycle. When the clinic's single pathologist attempted to compare blood samples across age groups, he found biochemical irregularities that suggested acute toxicity rather than infection, elevated levels of compounds that didn't belong in the human body. Ilyin quietly contacted a former colleague in Kazan, who now worked in environmental toxicology, and asked, without specifics, if groundwater contamination could present with central nervous system disruptions, hemorrhagic rash, and respiratory inflammation all at once. The answer came 2 days later, vague and nervous. Yes, but such a mixture would have to be deliberate. That same afternoon, 2 men in black coats arrived at the clinic, flashing identification that no one questioned too closely. They spent 10 minutes in the lab, 20 minutes in the records office, and left without a word. The next morning, the blood samples were gone, and Ilyin received a directive on Ministry of Health letterhead instructing all staff to cease further speculation and to label the illness a novel influenza-like respiratory syndrome with gastrointestinal complications. A regional bulletin was issued to surrounding districts advising against rumors of contamination and warning that false reports about state infrastructure could result in criminal charges. Nurses whispered to one another in break rooms. Families began boiling water obsessively, but no official notice was given and the water kept flowing. The town was still drinking, still bathing, still cooking. The sickness was no longer isolated. It was spreading with a rhythm, a pulse that mirrored the flow of taps and drains, yet no one in power would admit the pattern. And so, Severozorsk kept functioning like nothing was wrong, even as the people inside it were slowly unraveling from the inside out. The water system in Severozorsk had been designed in 1957 with the same utilitarian ethos that guided much of Soviet infrastructure, centralized, simple, and just efficient enough to work. Until it didn't. A single pumping station located on the outskirts of town, wedged between the abandoned grain silos and a collapsed storage shed, was responsible for drawing groundwater from the nearby aquifer and pushing it through a web of aging, corroded pipes that snaked beneath every apartment, school, and factory in the settlement. There were no filtration units, no chemical monitoring stations, no ultraviolet sterilizers, just a few rusted tanks and a primitive gravity-fed sediment basin that hadn't been cleaned in years. The man nominally in charge of this crucial system was Yuri Denin, a former factory machinist who had been reassigned to municipal services after a workplace accident left him partially deaf in one ear. He operated the station with the help of a single technician, Vadim, whose knowledge of plumbing extended mostly to tightening valves with a wrench and swearing at anything that leaked. Once a day, Yuri walked past the humming pump housing, checked the pressure gauges, logged readings by hand into a ledger, and smoked a cigarette behind the control shed before heading back into town. That was the extent of water management oversight in Severozorsk. No outside agency reviewed the logs. No one tested the output. There was no expectation of anomaly reporting unless the pipes physically ruptured. The town's leadership, what little of it there was, simply assumed that water would keep flowing because it always had. The plumbing infrastructure was brittle, lined with sediment, and prone to rust leaks during spring thaws, but it worked, or so they thought. In reality, it was the perfect delivery system for anyone wishing to contaminate the entire population without detection. The single point of entry at the intake valve meant that any substance introduced upstream would be evenly distributed across all households within hours, especially during high-usage periods like morning or evening. Worse, the town's entire loop ran on a closed recirculation system. Water not used immediately would re-enter storage tanks and cycle back into homes, creating sustained exposure over multiple days. When people began to fall ill, no one suspected the water at first. It looked the same. It didn't smell unusual. It ran clear. But that illusion of normalcy masked the fact that no one knew what they were drinking. And because the state had never invested in redundancy, no backup reservoirs, no alternate pumping line, no mechanism to isolate neighborhoods, the contamination, once introduced, was uncontainable. The very thing that had been designed to deliver life had become a perfect vector for sickness. It was brutal in its simplicity. No explosions, no agents in gas masks, just a pipe, a pump, and a poison flowing silently into the veins of a forgotten town. And no one, not the residents, not the clinic, not even Yuri, had the tools to stop it. They arrived on a Wednesday, two men in dark wool coats with satchels over their shoulders and an air of quiet authority that no one dared challenge. No one knew who had summoned them, only that they came from the ministry, a phrase that in Soviet towns meant both everything and nothing. Yuri Denin, the aging supervisor of Severozorsk's water station, remembered their boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel and how one of them didn't bother introducing himself before flashing a document with a red wax seal and a blue circular stamp. The paperwork was official, stamped, signed, and utterly unreadable in the way that made even the most skeptical bureaucrats nod without question. Routine infrastructure inspection, they said, orders from oblast level. And that was that. They carried their own tools, refused assistance, and moved through the station with unsettling precision. Not engineers looking for broken pipes, but operatives searching for something very specific. Vadim, the technician, later recalled how one of the men spent nearly an hour examining the intake valve's access hatch, measuring the depth of the main pipe, and taking detailed notes on water flow pressure. Another spent an afternoon inside the chemical storage shed that hadn't held anything but dust and spiders for years. When asked what they were looking for, one of them smiled and said, "Future upgrades." But they made no upgrades. They didn't repair anything. They didn't even check the sediment tanks or the cracked filtration basin that Yuri had warned them about. Instead, they returned twice more that week, once just before dusk, the other time just before dawn, each visit unannounced, each followed by a call to the municipal building that ended with a flustered secretary printing out access forms after the fact. They never returned after the third visit. The following Monday, the sickness began. At the time, no one connected the two. After all, officials' records logged the men as hydraulic consultants, their visit buried under routine maintenance requests. But years later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as former officials began speaking more freely and dusty archives were picked apart by journalists and historians, the testimonies surfaced, quiet, half-forgotten recollections of those men and their odd behavior. One local plumber, retired and living in Kazan by the mid-90s, admitted during a radio interview that he had seen similar figures in other small towns, always arriving in threes or twos, always with sealed orders, always vanishing just before outbreaks of unexplained illness. A pattern began to emerge, hidden in plain sight. The same stamped documents, the same sealed satchels, the same reluctance to answer questions. It was not incompetence. It was not negligence. It was preparation. Severozorsk had not been chosen because something broke. It had been prepared in advance, evaluated, mapped, and approved for whatever was coming. The pipes were sound. The flow was measured. The delivery system was perfect. All it needed was a signal, and those two men, whoever they were, had brought it. It would take nearly a decade for the truth to emerge, buried in fragments across declassified documents, whispered testimonies, and the decaying archives of a state that no longer existed. But when it did, what surfaced was far more horrifying than anyone in Severozorsk had imagined. The poison in the town's water supply had not been an industrial accident or sabotage from a foreign enemy. It was an intentional exposure to a controlled chemical biological agent, engineered by a covert division within the Soviet Military Medical Corps for the purpose of studying physiological reactions in live, unaware civilian populations. Officially designated compound K56, the substance was a hybrid derivative synthesized from an organophosphate base, related chemically to agricultural pesticides, but modified to include bioengineered enzymes that could induce specific sequences of neurological and gastrointestinal failure over an adjustable window of time. It had no taste, no smell, no visible trace in water. It was created to spread quietly, symmetrically, and then metabolize before typical autopsies could isolate it. K56's purpose was not battlefield deployment. It was data. The directive behind its use came not from a general, but from a gray-suited committee buried inside the Ministry of Defense's Directorate of Non-Conventional Response, a unit whose entire mission was to develop weapons not to kill enemies, but to understand how people died from them. Severozorsk had been selected for Phase 2 field testing because it mirrored the demographic composition of rural Western European towns, mixed age groups, a contained water system, and low external scrutiny. The experiment was meant to answer three core questions. What was the agent's latency period? How did different ages respond to varying concentrations? And could subtle physiological collapse mimic naturally occurring disease well enough to avoid detection? To ensure those questions were answered, the town had been mapped weeks in advance. Agent deployment had been precisely timed and administered via injection into the main waterline junction upstream of the intake valve during the second night visit by the so-called engineers. The dosage was calibrated to create a cascading illness profile, mild symptoms in the first 48 hours, sharp neurological decline after 72, and for a select few, complete systemic failure within 6 days. The goal was not maximum lethality, but range, to simulate a soft kill weapon that could incapacitate a population just long enough to disrupt infrastructure without drawing immediate suspicion. A month later, results were compiled, patient logs quietly confiscated, and internal memos circulated through closed military channels praising the data integrity of the Severozorsk exposure. No one was held accountable. No corrective measures were taken. The town had been poisoned not by mistake, not by malice, but by calculation, chosen like a laboratory rat, injected, observed, and discarded. The people of Severozorsk had been turned into case studies. Their suffering had been graphed. And for the men who signed the orders, that was the only outcome that mattered. The silencing began before the funerals. In the third week of the outbreak, after 3 children, 2 elderly residents, and a factory foreman had died within 72 hours of each other, a convoy of unmarked black Zeal cars arrived from the regional center under the cover of a snowstorm. The doctors at the Severozorsk clinic, already exhausted and demoralized, were summoned to a meeting in the municipal administration building, where a man in a gray overcoat and leather gloves introduced himself only as Deputy Inspector Grigoriev. He read from a prepared statement that the recent deaths were to be attributed to a rare seasonal bacterial infection, exacerbated by poor nutrition and pre-existing health conditions. No further inquiries would be permitted. All clinical records pertaining to cases dated from March 12th onward were to be handed over immediately for processing by central health authorities. Dr. Mikhail Ilyin, who had documented dozens of cases in his private ledger, hesitated, prompting 2 uniformed men to escort him into a side room. When he returned 10 minutes later, he said nothing and handed over everything. Over the next 48 hours, death certificates were reissued with updated causes: cardiopulmonary arrest, natural respiratory failure, age-related complications. Families who requested autopsies were told the town lacked proper facilities. Those who insisted received unexpected visits: stern-faced strangers who sat at their kitchen tables, drank their tea without invitation, and reminded them gently that misinformation about public health was punishable under Soviet law. The widow of the factory foreman found herself demoted from her position at the post office and reassigned to window cleaning duty after she questioned her husband's death in front of co-workers. Nurses at the clinic were rotated out to remote field posts. 2 disappeared entirely. Word spread quickly that it was best to grieve quietly. The town's newspaper, Severozorsk Worker, ran a single article in the middle of the page 4, describing a brief wave of seasonal illness, now fully stabilized thanks to the swift action of state medical services. No further reports were allowed. Even the school teachers were given a script to follow, reassuring children that the recent absences were part of the usual spring flu. In Moscow, the file marked Severozorsk Exposure 2B was sealed with a blue security ribbon and moved to an internal archive labeled Experimental Metrics, Non-Theater. The town, once plotted for its demographic symmetry, was now erased from internal communications. No debriefings were scheduled, no investigative teams dispatched. As far as the ministry was concerned, the operation had yielded valuable data and concluded successfully. Severozorsk was no longer needed. It faded from maps, from reports, and eventually from memory, relegated to a footnote in a secret war of numbers and symptoms where the only enemy was truth and the only victims were those deemed too invisible to matter. For years the silence held. sealed behind grief, shame, and the quiet knowledge that asking too many questions in the Soviet Union often led nowhere good. But in the decade following the USSR's collapse, fragments of Severozorsk's truth began to slip through the cracks, not through newspapers or official investigations, but through the voices of survivors reconnecting in unlikely ways. It began with a letter, a simple handwritten note sent from a former schoolteacher named Galina Petrovna to her cousin in Yekaterinburg, reminiscing about the bitter winter of 1972 and mentioning the bad water that had left her bedridden for weeks and taken little Kolya from the apartment downstairs. Her cousin, stunned, responded with a memory of a former coworker, also from Severozorsk, who had told a nearly identical story years before. Same month, same symptoms, same denials. From there, the thread unspooled. In chat rooms frequented by Soviet-era veterans and displaced villagers, mentions of Severozorsk triggered more than nostalgia. They triggered recognition. One man, Pavel Denisov, who had moved to Kazan in the late 80s, described how his mother and uncle had both developed tremors and hallucinations that March, followed by unexplained deaths classified as cardiac arrest. Another woman, Irina Rusanova, recalled that her father, the town's former electrician, had once confided that the water glowed green in a bucket when left overnight, but that he'd been warned never to report it. More and more people emerged, each bringing small, jagged pieces of a larger puzzle, identical symptoms, identical timelines, identical silences. What had once felt like personal tragedy, isolated and shamefully unspeakable, began to take on the shape of something systemic, something too precise to be coincidence. Patterns were drawn, names compared, maps redrawn from memory. Children who had been 5 or 6 at the time, now adults in their 30s and 40s, shared the oddities they remembered. The sudden arrival of men in gray coats, the brief closure of the school for plumbing repairs, the thick, bitter taste in tea that no one talked about aloud. Some survivors still bore the physical toll, neurological tremors, chronic fatigue, reproductive issues, once chalked up to stress or poor diet, now seen as the residue of something far more deliberate. And yet, despite the growing web of consistency, there were still no headlines, no confessions, no reparations. The archives were sealed, the officials dead or vanished, the clinic records destroyed. But memory proved harder to erase. The people of Severozorsk, those who lived through it, those who lost, those who simply remembered, began writing it down. Notebooks, interviews, self-published memoirs, scattered like breadcrumbs across a country trying to forget its past. This wasn't chaos, they realized. It was choreography. A script written in secret, performed on their bodies without consent. And now, at last, the survivors were starting to tell the story no one else would. In the ruthless logic of Cold War statecraft, the Soviet Union believed that the most effective weapons were the ones never acknowledged, and the safest place to test them was at home, on people who couldn't refuse, couldn't resist, and, most importantly, couldn't talk. While the Western Bloc obsessed over nuclear parity and long-range missile deterrence, Soviet military research increasingly diverted funds into more subtle, insidious forms of warfare. Toxins, bioweapons, neurochemical agents that could be used not to destroy cities, but to quietly cripple them. But deploying such weapons on NATO soil came with risk, detection, diplomatic backlash, war. And war, the Kremlin knew, was a game of perception. Every move had to be deniable. That meant experiments needed to be invisible. Scientists within the Ministry of Defense understood that testing these agents on animals or in controlled laboratory settings would never produce useful combat data. Human physiology, variable, social conditions, and infrastructure dynamics could not be replicated in a lab. They needed real environments, real towns, real chaos. Foreign enemies were too risky. Soviet citizens, on the other hand, were already under surveillance, already tightly controlled, and, when deemed expendable, already silenced. To the architects of these programs, Severozorsk wasn't a betrayal of the people. It was a strategic asset. It was remote, demographically balanced, socially obedient, and unimportant to the greater machine. Testing on a town like Severozorsk allowed military researchers to observe what no simulation ever could: how a civilian population responded physically, psychologically, and logistically to invisible illness. how quickly rumors spread, how long it took for hospitals to collapse, how effective state suppression could be when the source of the suffering was unacknowledged and the victims didn't know they were part of a test. These questions had value, tactical, operational, geopolitical value. The reports generated from the K-56 exposure weren't stored in health ministry archives. They were submitted to a black budget committee embedded within the Soviet Academy of Sciences, cross-referenced against past experiments in other Category B zones across Central Asia and the Baltic periphery. In those reports, the residents of Severozorsk were not referred to as citizens, but as Population Group SK563. Their suffering was converted into data tables, symptom onset, mortality intervals, behavioral deviation scores. It was cold, precise, and utterly devoid of humanity. And the decision-makers believed it was justified. In their view, the survival of the state outweighed the survival of any individual, any family, any town. They believed in control. They believed in silence. And they believed, above all, that secrecy was the greatest shield of all. The experiment in Severozorsk proved that belief correct. No one spoke, no one resisted. No one even knew what had happened, until it was too late. The state had done what it always promised it would, protect itself, no matter the cost. The first fragment surfaced in '94, an inventory ledger mislabeled as Sanitary Logistics, Volga District, discovered by a junior archivist in a newly declassified Ministry of Defense annex in Novosibirsk. Most of it was innocuous: tables of medical supplies, footnotes on iodine distribution, bulk soap rations. But halfway through, on a dog-eared page, a single line item was handwritten in faded ink: K-56 dispersion, Severozorsk trial phase, March 1972. All outcomes logged to Archive 9 key. It was the first piece of evidence that directly tied a known chemical agent to the forgotten town, a place that, officially, had never suffered any disaster. Word spread quietly among academic circles, passed from archivists to historians to surviving doctors who still remembered that spring with unease. Over the next 5 years, a trickle of documentation emerged from regional offices no longer under the full control of Moscow, requisition forms for medical evacuation that were never acted upon, sealed medical reports signed by military pathologists who had never worked in civilian clinics, and above all, internal communications stamped with a red hammer and sickle watermark marked Category B compliance, do not duplicate. By 2001, investigative journalists had begun compiling a skeletal timeline of what happened in Severozorsk, but every attempt to access the full file, Archive 9 core, was blocked by what remained of the Russian security apparatus. The K-56 program was never officially acknowledged. The experiment itself remained unnamed. And as decades passed, many of those responsible had either died, disappeared, or were quietly absorbed into other departments. The survivors, some now living as far away as Canada or Israel, were left with partial confirmation but no justice. No trials, no tribunals, no reparations, not even a single official apology. The Russian Federation issued a blanket statement in 2004 that no evidence exists of unauthorized human experimentation during the Soviet period, a lie buried under layers of plausible deniability. Local authorities in the region where Severozorsk once stood denied any such town had existed at all, citing administrative restructuring for the gap in maps. By then, most of the original buildings had been demolished. The few remaining residents had either moved away or died, and the town had effectively been erased, not just from record, but from memory. And yet, the truth lingered, embedded in those fragile documents, in the margins of declassified memos, in the quiet recollections of those who never forgot the taste of that water or the smell of bleach in the clinic after the men in gray coats had gone. The truth came, yes, but it came too late. Too late to prosecute, too late to save, too late to matter to anyone but the ones who had always known something terrible had happened, and had waited their entire lives for the world to simply say, "Yes, we did this to you." But the world never said it. The truth was there, just not the reckoning. There were no sirens in Severozorsk, no tanks, no gunfire, no foreign planes streaking overhead or enemy troops marching down its central avenue. There was no declaration of war, no protest, no resistance. There was only water, silent, clear, and lethal, flowing through the pipes of a town that had been chosen to disappear before anyone even knew it was dying. The Cold War was filled with images of brinkmanship and bluster. Missiles paraded through Red Square, spy planes shot from the sky, speeches pounded into podiums on both sides of the Iron Curtain. But none of that spectacle reached Severozorsk. It was not a Cold War battleground. It was a controlled environment, an invisible line in a playbook written by men who saw people as variables and suffering as data. In this town, war wasn't waged with bombs, but with biology. The enemy wasn't a foreign soldier. It was a clipboard, a formula, a signature on a sealed order. Severozorsk became one of the Cold War's quietest crimes, not because it failed to matter, but because it was designed never to be remembered. The true atrocity wasn't just in the deaths or the denials. It was in the cold calculus that allowed it all. Bureaucrats turned families into footnotes. Scientists converted illness into yield curves. Generals approved operations where the collateral damage was measured in silence. The town's sacrifice had no strategic necessity, no moral justification, no defensive purpose. It served only to test the boundaries of control. How much could be done without anyone ever knowing? And even after the truth leaked out, long after the archives began to open and the regime that ordered it crumbled to dust, no one came to make it right. There were no monuments for the dead, no investigations, no reparations. The names of the victims were never read aloud in any chamber of power. Severozorsk remains a phantom, its memory kept alive only by the handful of survivors who remember what the doctors refused to write down, what the state forced them to forget, what the world never cared to hear. This was not a war crime broadcast to the world. It was not recorded by satellites or whispered through diplomatic channels. It was a crime so quiet, so methodically erased that it took 30 years for the truth to even take shape. And by then, it was too late. The Cold War did not need fire to leave scars. It needed only a lie big enough and a population small enough for that lie to hold. Severozorsk was that lie. And long after the wall fell, long after the slogans faded and the uniforms changed, the poison still lingers, not in the water, but in the fact that it could happen. It did happen. And almost no one remembers. Almost. If this story moved you, share it. Not for shock, not for blame, but because stories like these were never meant to survive. They were buried under secrecy, fear, and indifference. Spread the truth. Talk about the forgotten. Make sure this town isn't erased. Again. The Cold War left behind more than history. It left ghosts. Let's not leave them unheard.